Walter Jennings never saw it coming. That was the most brutal part. Not the chill that seeped through the upstate New York window panes, not even the ache in his knees as he stood in the shadow of the hallway, but the sting of being dismissed from his own family, like a winter jacket tossed aside at the start of spring. It happened so fast, and yet, if Walter was honest, the signs had always been there. Just easier to ignore in the soft haze of loyalty and habit. The scent of burnt coffee still lingered in the kitchen when Lisa slammed the stack of bills on the table, her manicured fingers trembling, not from cold, but from something sharper, resentment, exhaustion, maybe greed. Doug, her husband, barely glanced up from the glowing television, as if the family drama unfolding behind him was just white noise to whatever sports debate kept him fixed and absent. It was the 3rd year since Walter had sold the old house in Manlius, the house with the cherry tree he'd planted the day Lisa was born, the one his late wife had filled with laughter and the scent of her cinnamon rolls. He remembered that last autumn in his own living room, staring at boxes packed by strangers, the wallpaper pale where family photos had once hung. Lisa's voice had been so gentle then, so convincing. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone anymore. We have room and we'd love for you to stay." The room, it turned out, came with a price. Every month his pension, what he called his 38 years of elbows and sweat, dissolved quietly into Lisa and Doug's account. The story they told him and themselves was that this was family, this was the right thing, this was love. Tonight, Walter saw the truth written plainly across Lisa's tense jaw. She tossed another bill in his direction, as if each utility invoice was a verdict on his worth. $300 for electric, $250 for gas. The words snapped through the kitchen, sharper than the ice gathering outside on the eaves. "We're drowning here, Dad. You just sit there like you don't even notice." Walter's hands folded in his lap, the rough skin mapped by decades at GE, by late nights reading Lisa's stories after double shifts, by holding his wife's hand as the cancer ate her away. He swallowed, the words stuck behind a lifetime of swallowing. But Doug looked up at last, tired of pretending to be uninvolved. "It's not enough anymore, Walt. We're grateful. Sure. But life's changed." The talk wasn't about money, not really. It was about power, about who belonged and who was simply tolerated. Lisa's voice climbed higher, her eyes darting to Doug as if she needed backup. "Your pension might have covered things for you and Mom, but it doesn't stretch for 3. We need real help, or..." The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavier than any winter coat. Walter felt every word. He'd paid for this house, $130,000 as a down payment from the sale of his own. He'd covered medical bills, school fees, even the repairs when Doug's car broke down last summer. Now, the math was different. "We're not asking for much," Lisa said, but her mouth twisted on the lie. The silence thickened, broken only by the TV's distant laughter track. Walter tried to remember the last time laughter in this house hadn't sounded forced. He looked at Lisa and saw flashes of the girl she used to be, her first steps in the Manlius backyard, her prom photo with braces, the way she'd hugged him so tight the day she left for college in Albany. But all that was gone now, replaced by the strained lines of adulthood, the debts, the longings, the sharp edges of disappointment. Maybe Walter thought that was just how it went. Maybe he'd fooled himself into believing that love, like pension checks and family dinners, would last longer than it did. The argument, if you could call it that, was brief and efficient. Lisa's voice lost its softness, became clipped, almost corporate. "We need to be realistic, Dad. The way things are, you'll need to find a way to contribute more or..." Doug filled in the blank, not with words, but with the flat, dismissive shake of his head. There was nowhere to go in that moment. Nowhere but the memory of all those years he'd worked overtime, all those holidays spent in coveralls instead of at home. For an instant, Walter wondered if this was how exile always began. Not with a bang, but a quiet, logical betrayal disguised as necessity. Then, as if to prove the cruelty was casual, Lisa pulled a wrinkled $5 bill from her purse and shoved it at him. "Go get a lottery ticket, Dad. Maybe that'll finally do us all some good." Doug barked out a bitter laugh, the kind that hides fear and pettiness. "Maybe you'll get lucky, old man." There it was, the final nudge. Not just unwanted, but sent away on a fool's errand. Walter took the money. The bill was soft and tired, like it had changed too many hands. He said nothing as he slipped on his coat, every movement slow, deliberate, like he was putting on armor. Outside, the November sky over Syracuse pressed low, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave no matter how many layers you wear. The walk to the Tops convenience store felt endless, each step a review of every sacrifice, every small act of kindness, every promise broken by the people he'd given everything to. The sidewalks glittered with ice, Christmas lights twinkled from windows, the world going on as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He reached the store, greeted by the friendly nod of Raj, the clerk who'd known him as a regular for years. Tonight, Walter's voice was steady, almost hollow. 3 tickets, please. 1 for Lisa Miller. He spelled her name out carefully. And 2 for Walter Jennings. The machine spat out the tickets with a mechanical sigh. He tucked Lisa's into his front pocket. The other 2 slipped deep into his wallet behind an old photo of his late wife and a half-torn card from Lisa's first Mother's Day as a mom herself. On the walk back, Walter's mind turned over every detail. He pictured Lisa and Doug, back in the kitchen, probably already arguing about how to spend money they didn't have. He pictured his own hands, calloused and shaking, holding the last remnants of pride. The anger in him wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, like the snow beginning to drift across the city, silent and inevitable. At home, he laid the 3 tickets on the table, watched as Lisa's eyes flickered with something between hope and disdain. Doug snorted, barely pretending to care. "Maybe this is it," Lisa muttered. "Maybe this is finally our lucky break." Walter almost smiled at that, almost. There was a kind of bleak humor in being sent out into the night, armed with nothing but luck and humiliation. He retired to his room upstairs, the walls thin enough to hear Lisa's voice as she whispered her plans. "Florida," she said. "We could buy a place in Naples, just walk away from all this." Doug fantasized about paying off his debts, about traveling to places where no one knew who he was or what he owed. They didn't even bother to keep their greed a secret anymore, sure that tomorrow their world would change. Walter lay on his narrow bed, the springs creaking beneath him. He stared at the ceiling, at the faint shadow of the light fixture, and tried to recall the last time he'd felt at home. Maybe it was a decade ago, with his wife's laughter echoing down the hall. Maybe it was never. There was a knock on the door. Lisa, suddenly contrite, said, "Dad, don't take it the wrong way. We're just under a lot of pressure." But he heard the hollow in her words, the way guilt and calculation danced together. "Of course," he replied. "I understand." He always had. In the darkness, Walter allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to win. Not the money, but something better. The dignity of choosing his own fate. The justice of watching truth break through the lies. He thought about all the ways the world could turn in a single night, all the invisible forces that might finally set things right. And as the city of Syracuse fell into uneasy sleep, a spark of something new flickered in his chest. Not hope, not quite, but resolve. Something was coming. He could feel it as surely as the coming snowstorm, as surely as the past refusing to stay buried. Tomorrow the world would look the same to everyone else. But not to Walter. Not ever again. Walter Jennings woke before dawn. The ache in his shoulder a stubborn echo of all those years on the factory floor. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic on I-81, and for a moment let the silence wash over him. The house felt cold, not just with the late November air, but with something lonelier, an emptiness that had grown over time, quiet and persistent, the kind you don't notice until it's already taken up residence in your chest. It was still dark outside when he padded down the hall, past the faded photos of Lisa as a child, past the wedding picture of himself and Margaret smiling on a spring day in 1980, when everything had seemed possible. The kitchen clock blinked 5:27. Walter filled the coffee pot with water and set it to brew, his hands moving out of habit. He opened the fridge, counted eggs for breakfast, and paused as the refrigerator light washed over stacks of groceries. He noticed the yogurt cups Lisa liked, Doug's brand of hot sauce, the bottle of wine sitting unopened since Easter. He never minded shopping or cooking for the family. It gave him purpose, let him feel useful even as the years caught up to him. Sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself standing in the doorway, just listening to the quiet, pretending that Margaret might wander in with a sleepy smile and ask why he was up so late. There was a time, not so long ago, when this house had been filled with warmth. He remembered the first Christmas here, after Margaret's funeral, when Lisa insisted he spend it with her family. He'd brought a box of ornaments from the old house, each one a small memory, Lisa's handprint in clay, the glass hummingbird Margaret had bought at the state fair, the world's best dad mug from some forgotten Father's Day. He tried to recreate the sense of home, but it never quite fit, like wearing another man's coat. The new house was bigger, brighter, filled with the promise of a future he couldn't seem to find a place in. He poured a cup of coffee, black and strong, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the heater. He could see the backyard through the sliding doors, the frost silvering the grass, the swing set still and lonely. He thought about the day Lisa fell from that swing as a little girl, how she'd run to him, blood streaming from her scraped knee, demanding he fix it right now. He'd carried her inside, patched her up with Band-Aids and chocolate milk. It struck him now how simple things were back then. She'd trusted him to make everything right. He wondered when that trust had turned to resentment, when her hugs became stiff, her words clipped, her eyes always darting somewhere else. Doug's alarm went off upstairs, a muffled tune he barely recognized. Soon he'd be thudding down the stairs, already talking about work, bills, how hard things were. Walter knew those conversations by heart, the rehearsed complaints, the carefully rationed gratitude. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if Margaret had lived, if she would have noticed the shift before it became a chasm. Margaret always saw through people, right to the soft parts they tried to hide. He missed her most in these quiet moments, missed her laughter, her advice, the gentle way she'd urge him not to be so stubborn, to forgive Lisa her sharp edges. He looked at the stack of bills on the table, the neat rows of numbers and threats, and felt a flicker of anger, not just at the debt, but at himself for letting it get this far. He'd taught Lisa about budgeting, about responsibility, about the dignity of paying your way. He'd worked overtime to make sure she could go to Syracuse University, paid off her student loans when she got married, helped with the down payment for this house. Every dollar was a promise that she'd be safe, that she'd remember where she came from. But memory, he realized, is a slippery thing. People forget the sacrifices made for them, especially when life gets tight. As daylight crept in, Walter wandered into the living room, his steps careful, quiet. The furniture was nice enough, all neutral colors and clean lines. He traced a finger over the mantel, lingering on the framed photo of Lisa holding her newborn daughter, Emily. He hadn't seen much of Emily lately. Doug said she was busy with school, with friends, with growing up. Sometimes Walter caught glimpses of her in the hallway, her hair falling over her face as she scrolled through her phone, oblivious to the world around her. Once, she'd brought him a drawing, a crayon picture of the two of them fishing at Green Lake. He'd pinned it to the fridge, right next to Lisa's weekly meal plan. The drawing disappeared a week later, replaced by a coupon for takeout. He never asked where it went. He found himself thinking of the neighbors, the older couple across the street, the Andersons. He'd helped Mr. Anderson fix his mailbox after a snowplow knocked it down last winter. They'd shared coffee in the garage, swapping stories about the old days, about their kids, about how things had changed. Walter liked those moments, small reminders that kindness still mattered, even if it went unnoticed by the people closest to him. There were other memories, too, some sharper, some softer. The day he helped a young boy at the library, stopped a group of older kids from roughing him up. The gratitude in the boy's eyes stuck with him. That boy, Tyler, now worked at the bank down the road. Sometimes they'd run into each other at the coffee shop, exchange a few words. Walter never mentioned the past. He didn't have to. Tyler always gave him a smile that said he remembered. He wandered back to his room, past the boxes stacked in the corner. His life condensed into cardboard and tape, waiting for a destination. He sat on the bed and opened the bottom drawer of his nightstand, pulling out the letter Margaret wrote him the week before she died. Her handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged from tears. He read it often, especially on mornings like this, when he needed her voice in his ear. Walter, love is about patience and boundaries. Forgive your daughter, but don't let yourself disappear for her comfort. You have to fight for your own dignity. You have to remember who you are. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw. He wasn't sure he knew who he was anymore. Husband, father, provider, those titles faded as the years passed. What remained was something quieter, a stubborn core that refused to yield, even when the world told him to step aside. He looked at the lottery tickets on his nightstand, lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. The thought made him laugh. A dry, humorless sound. Margaret would have teased him for buying them, called him a romantic fool. Maybe she was right. By mid-morning, the house was awake. Lisa bustled around the kitchen, making calls, planning the day. Doug shuffled through the mail, tossing bills onto the growing pile. Walter offered to help with errands, but Lisa waved him off, distracted. There was always something more urgent, always a reason not to include him. He spent the afternoon walking the neighborhood, nodding at familiar faces, stopping by the hardware store for a conversation with the owner, Mr. Malloy. They talked about the coming snow, about the high school football team, about anything except family. Back home, Walter sat in the recliner by the window, watching as Lisa and Doug argued in low voices in the kitchen. He couldn't hear their words, but he recognized the rhythms: blame, frustration, plans for a future that always seemed just out of reach. He remembered his own parents, the way they'd fought quietly behind closed doors, the way his mother would emerge later, her smile brittle and tired. Family, he thought, was never simple. He drifted into a nap, dreaming of Margaret's laughter, of Emily's small hand in his, of Lisa's voice as a child, bright and hopeful. When he woke, the house was dark. Doug was gone, Lisa's car missing from the driveway. Walter made himself a sandwich, ate in silence, washed the plate, set it on the rack to dry. He wandered into the den, flipping through the channels until the news blurred into static. At midnight, Lisa came home, her face drawn, eyes red. She didn't see him sitting in the dark, didn't know he heard her crying in the kitchen. He wanted to go to her, to hold her like he did when she was small, to tell her it would be okay. But the years had built walls between them, high and solid. He watched her from the doorway, unseen, a ghost in his own life. Before heading to bed, Walter checked the tickets one more time. He didn't believe in luck, not really. But something in the quiet of the night, in the memory of Margaret's words, made him hope for something different. A chance to rewrite the story, to remind Lisa and Doug that he was more than an old man taking up space. He was still Walter Jennings, and somewhere inside he still remembered how to fight for himself. He stood in the hallway, the old floorboards creaking under his weight, and looked at the family photos lining the wall. Each face a reminder of everything he'd built, everything he'd lost, everything he still carried. He let his hand rest on the frame of the photo from Lisa's high school graduation, the day he promised her she could always count on him. Maybe it was time for her to remember that, too. The house was silent, but his mind buzzed with questions, with possibilities, with a growing sense that something was about to change. For the first time in a long while, he felt awake. Walter Jennings moved through the next few days as if the world had slowed to half speed. Every gesture thick with meaning. Every glance from Lisa or Doug heavier than it should have been. There was a coldness now, an invisible line drawn between him and the rest of the family, and even the walls of the house seemed to shrink in, pushing him toward the edges. The tickets sat hidden in his nightstand, their presence a constant thrum in the back of his mind. He checked them every morning, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves in the night, as if fate would grow impatient and grant him an answer before the appointed day. On Sunday evening, as the wind battered the siding, Walter caught Lisa and Doug whispering in the kitchen. He heard his own name, followed by the words nursing home and inheritance. Doug's voice, always slick when he wanted something, said, "With that kind of money, We can start over somewhere warm. Naples, Miami, hell, even Charleston if you want. Dad will be just fine. Places like Briarwood take good care of their residents. Lisa hesitated, her voice thin with uncertainty, but Doug pressed on. He can barely get up the stairs anymore. Lise, you want to keep changing his meds, handling his bills, watching him fade away right in front of you? Or do you want your life back? Walter stood in the hallway, unseen, clutching the edge of the doorframe until his knuckles whitened. The ache in his chest had nothing to do with age or cholesterol. It was something colder, something brittle and permanent. He listened as Lisa gave a soft sigh, the kind of sound she'd made as a child when she gave in to something she knew was wrong. Maybe it's for the best, she whispered. Maybe it's time to put ourselves first. He returned to his room and stared at his reflection in the window, searching for the man he used to be. The words from Margaret's letter echoed in his mind, but forgiveness felt 1,000 miles away. He spent the night lying awake, every small sound magnified, every shadow stretched long across the ceiling. He thought of all the times he'd sat up with Lisa when she was sick, the way she'd called for him in the dark, sure he'd come. What had changed? Was it really only money that separated them now, or was it something deeper? A slow erosion of faith, of gratitude, of family itself? Monday brought a new kind of dread. Walter watched Doug sit at the dining room table, poring over a stack of mail. There were bank statements, credit card bills, insurance forms, and in the middle of it all, a folder marked Jennings, power of attorney. Doug's eyes flicked up, met Walter's, and darted away again, guilty and calculating. That afternoon, Walter noticed his own name missing from a joint account statement, replaced by Doug's. His pension checks had been routed elsewhere. Quietly, he began collecting his records. Bank statements, tax forms, Margaret's will, even old receipts. Tucking them into a battered briefcase he hadn't used in years. He remembered a time, just after Margaret died, when he'd trusted Doug. The younger man had seemed steady, helpful, stepping in to help with bills and legal paperwork. Looking back, Walter realized how quickly that help had turned into control, how easily small acts of kindness had become levers for manipulation. He wondered how many other choices he'd surrendered out of loneliness, how many boundaries had faded out of fear of being alone. As the week wore on, Walter noticed other things too, the missing cash from his wallet, the way Lisa suddenly had answers ready when the pharmacist called about his prescriptions, the times Doug made excuses to borrow his car. He started to see the shape of the scheme. A slow siphoning of resources, each piece small enough to be explained away, but together forming a pattern as clear as a fingerprint. It was as if the people he loved most had become strangers overnight, but maybe they'd been drifting this way for years. One morning, Walter walked to the bank on Fayette Street. Tyler, the teller he'd helped all those years ago, was working behind the counter. Walter waited for a lull, then approached, his voice low. "Tyler, would you mind helping me check something? I think there's been some confusion with my accounts." Tyler nodded, his eyes wary but kind. As they reviewed the transactions, Tyler frowned. "There's been a lot of activity here, Mr. Jennings. A few automatic withdrawals, new accounts opened last spring, all with Doug's signature. Did you authorize these?" Walter shook his head, shame and anger warring inside him. Tyler promised to flag the suspicious transactions, to send copies of the paperwork to Walter's address. Before he left, Tyler squeezed his hand, the same way he had when he was a frightened boy. "Let me know if you need anything else," he said quietly. That evening, Walter set up an old tape recorder in his room, its red light blinking softly as he practiced how he might confront Lisa and Doug, rehearsing the words until his throat ached. He started documenting everything, scribbling notes in the margins of his checkbook, keeping a log of every conversation. He learned to listen for subtext, to watch for glances passed over his head, to recognize the coded language of people plotting behind his back. But he also found himself remembering small mercies, moments that complicated his anger. There was the night last winter when Lisa found him shivering on the porch, having locked himself out. She wrapped him in a blanket and made him tea, sitting with him in silence until his hands stopped shaking. Or the afternoon Doug changed the oil in his car without being asked, leaving a can of his favorite root beer on the passenger seat. These memories flickered in the shadows, reminders that nothing was ever simple, that love and resentment often grew from the same roots. Walter took long walks through the neighborhood, thinking, planning, remembering. He visited the library and checked out books on elder law, on trusts and estates, on how to recognize and prevent financial abuse. He spoke with a volunteer at the senior center, learned about advocacy groups and legal clinics, collected pamphlets on his rights. Each new fact was a brick in a wall he was building, a way to reclaim his life one small step at a time. He avoided Lisa and Doug as much as possible, kept to himself, moved like a ghost through the house. But even as he withdrew, he watched, collecting evidence in silence. He noted the times they spoke in low voices when they thought he was asleep, the way they pounced on the mail before he could check it, the sudden bursts of cheerfulness when they needed something from him. He wondered if they could sense the shift, if they knew he was no longer as blind as they hoped. Late one night, Walter overheard Lisa on the phone with her cousin in Boston. "We'll be able to help you out soon," she said, her voice falsely bright. "Doug and I are finally catching a break." There was a pause, a laugh, a reference to a windfall that would set everything right. Walter felt the anger rise again, cold and sharp, and for the first time, he let himself imagine what life would be like without them, what it would be to belong to himself again. He began to test boundaries, little things at first. He changed his online banking passwords. He stopped leaving his wallet on the dresser. He withdrew a small amount of cash and stored it in a book, just in case. The small acts of defiance gave him a measure of peace, a sense that he was not entirely powerless. He realized that he'd allowed himself to become a bystander in his own life, but that didn't mean he had to stay one. On Wednesday, Walter received a letter in the mail, addressed in Margaret's looping script. He knew it was old, sent years ago, lost and only now returned by the postal service. He opened it carefully, hands trembling. Inside, Margaret wrote of faith and forgiveness, of the importance of fighting for dignity even when it seems easier to give in. "No one gets to decide when your story is over, Walter. You don't have to be a victim, not for anyone. Remember who you are, and don't let love turn into a leash." The letter was a lifeline, a reminder that even if his world had narrowed, his choices still mattered. He sat in his room, reading it again and again, the anger slowly melting into resolve. He would not let himself be erased. He would not give Lisa and Doug the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. He would find a way to remind them that he was more than a burden, more than a source of money or guilt or shame. Thursday evening, as the sun set over the city, Walter made his decision. He would gather his evidence, protect what was his, and prepare for whatever came next. He looked at the tickets, lined up on his nightstand, and felt the first stirrings of hope. He didn't know if luck was real, but he knew that courage was, and that sometimes all it took to change everything was the decision to stop being afraid. Walter Jennings moved through Friday morning with a deliberate quietness, almost as if he was trying not to disturb the air in the house. He'd learned how to make himself invisible when necessary, learned the value of silence and patience from years in the plant, from decades as a father and husband. Today, though, every gesture felt sharper, every moment packed with a meaning that seemed to hum beneath the surface. He could hear Lisa and Doug in the kitchen, their voices low and tense, the cadence of people trying to hide their excitement. It had started with a text Lisa received the night before, a message from her cousin in Boston. "Counting down the days till you're out of that dump," it read. "Drinks on you when the money hits." Walter hadn't meant to see it, but the phone was left face up on the table, and the message glowed like a warning flare. It all felt so surreal, the way his own life had become a set piece in someone else's fantasy, the way his home had become a launching pad for other people's dreams. Walter opened the drawer of his nightstand and stared at the 3 tickets, the edges already worn from his handling them. 2 with his own name, 1 carefully printed for Lisa Miller. He thought of the moment at Tops, how deliberate he'd been with the clerk, how strange it felt to watch her print his name, Walter Jennings, on those slips of paper. Something about it gave him a power he hadn't felt in years. He tucked the tickets back into his wallet, The one Margaret had bought him for his 40th birthday, the leather soft and scarred from decades of use. Mid-morning, Doug left to meet a realtor. He said it was about opportunities, but Walter recognized the false cheer in his voice, the edge of desperation beneath the surface. Lisa lingered over her coffee, scrolling through homes for sale in Naples, her thumb flicking through photos of palm trees and pools, never looking up when Walter entered the room. The sense of exile had never felt so complete, so final. He watched her for a moment, seeing the daughter he'd raised flicker across her face, then fade. Walter excused himself and walked to the den, dialed the number of an old friend, Paul Carmichael, a retired attorney he'd met at church years back. Paul answered on the second ring, his voice still as brisk and clear as ever. Walter explained the situation, careful not to let emotion edge in, asking about the legalities of lottery tickets, of signatures, of what constituted ownership in New York State. Paul listened carefully, then assured him. If the ticket had Walter's name printed on it, it was his and his alone, no matter who handed over the cash. That knowledge, simple and absolute, rooted deep in Walter's chest, a seed of certainty growing in the midst of chaos. He spent the afternoon sorting through his papers, stacking bank statements, insurance forms, and Margaret's will into neat piles. Each document felt like a brick in a wall he was building around himself, a defense against what was coming. He found old photographs tucked between the pages. A younger Lisa in her graduation gown, Doug in his first suit, Margaret with her hand on his shoulder, smiling into the sun. He studied each face, looking for the thread that had once held them together. The thread was frayed now, barely visible, but Walter refused to let go entirely. He wrote down the contact information for his new account in Ithaca, double-checked the balance, and set aside enough cash to see him through the next month, just in case. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first hints of snow began to swirl, Lisa suggested they all have dinner together, for old time's sake. The words tasted false, but Walter played along, helping set the table, pouring wine, making conversation. He could see the tension in the way Doug's hands shook, the way Lisa's laughter rang a little too loudly. The food tasted of endings, of a ritual meant to cover up what everyone knew but refused to say aloud. After dinner, Lisa brought out a small cake, store-bought, but with "To New Beginnings" piped in blue icing. Doug raised his glass, a toast to their bright future. And for a moment, the room shimmered with the possibility that things could be different. But Walter saw through it the way a man learns to see the flaw in a steel beam, the hairline crack that means the whole thing is about to give. When the cake was eaten, Doug pulled Lisa aside, whispered in her ear. Walter saw their eyes flick to the envelope where the tickets sat, saw the greed and hope and fear all tangled together in a single glance. Walter excused himself, saying he was tired, that he needed to check his blood sugar, that he might read before bed. In his room, he moved quickly, gathering the essentials: medication, wallet, Margaret's letter, the tickets, his phone, a spare set of clothes. He packed them into his old duffel, zipped it shut. He set out his coat and boots by the door, checked that his phone was fully charged, then sat on the bed and waited for the house to grow quiet. Downstairs, he heard Lisa and Doug arguing, their voices rising and falling, the cadence of old resentments and new anxieties. He heard Lisa say, "What if something goes wrong?" Doug replied with a certainty he didn't feel. "He's old, Lise. He'll go along with whatever we tell him. It's already done." The words landed like stones in Walter's chest, heavy and cold. He waited, listening, until their voices faded, until he heard the creak of their bedroom door, the muffled sound of a TV show playing low to lull them to sleep. Walter moved through the house with the stealth of habit, checking the locks, making sure the envelope with the losing ticket was in plain sight on the kitchen table. He left a note, brief and to the point. "Gone out. Don't wait up." He stepped outside, the cold biting his face, the air clean and sharp. He walked quickly, the duffel bouncing against his side, cutting through alleys and side streets until he reached the bus stop at the edge of the neighborhood. He rode into downtown Syracuse, the city lights blurring past, his heart pounding in his chest. He checked into a small motel off Erie Boulevard, paid in cash, and locked the door behind him. The room was clean and anonymous, the kind of place where no one would ask questions, where he could catch his breath and think. He laid the tickets on the nightstand, stared at them in the harsh light, feeling the weight of every choice he'd made to get here. The next morning, Walter called Paul again, confirming every detail, rehearsing the story he would tell the lottery commission, making sure every part of his plan was airtight. He called Tyler at the bank, asked him to keep an eye on any unusual activity. Tyler, ever loyal, promised he'd call if anything strange happened. Walter thanked him, hung up, and sat on the bed, staring out the window as the snow fell harder, blanketing the city in silence. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd built together, about the promises he'd made and the ones he'd broken. He thought about Lisa as a little girl, about Doug when he was still eager and kind. He let the grief come, let it wash over him, then let it go. He knew this wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had, and he would face it with whatever strength he had left. That afternoon, as he sat in the motel lobby sipping coffee, Walter saw a mother and child come in, shaking off the snow. The boy looked cold and scared, clinging to his mother's coat. Walter offered them a seat, shared a chocolate bar from his bag, made the boy smile with a silly joke about penguins and snowmen. For a moment, the pain in his chest eased, replaced by a warmth he'd almost forgotten. He realized then that his life was not over, that he still had things to give, still had choices to make. Back at the house, Lisa and Doug woke to find Walter's room empty, his duffel gone. The envelope with the losing ticket sat on the table, waiting. Doug picked it up, squinting at the name, then threw it down, frustration etched across his face. Lisa stared at the empty hallway, her mouth a tight line, her eyes filling with a dread she couldn't name. Walter spent the evening making a list of things he needed to do. Call the lottery office, arrange for the transfer of his pension, set up a new mailbox in Ithaca, find a storage unit for his belongings. Each task was a small step toward freedom, a way to carve out a future that belonged only to him. As night fell, he sat by the window, watching the snow fall, feeling the weight of the years slip away, replaced by a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt since he was a much younger man. He knew there would be pain ahead, that Lisa and Doug would not let go easily, that there would be pleas and threats and accusations. But he also knew that he was ready. He was not running away. He was running toward something, toward dignity, toward justice, toward a life where he could finally be himself again. Walter lay in bed that night, the city quiet around him, the ticket safe beneath his pillow. He closed his eyes and thought of Margaret, of her voice, her laughter, her unwavering belief in him. He let that belief fill him, carry him into sleep, into the promise of a new day. Walter Jennings awoke before sunrise, his heart pounding, unsure if the rhythm came from nerves or anticipation. He sat in the small motel room, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling as the city began to stir. The winning ticket rested in his wallet, folded neatly next to Margaret's letter, its existence almost too much to comprehend. Years of living quietly, of shrinking himself for the comfort of others, had led to this moment. He could still hear Lisa's voice in the kitchen 2 days before, shrill with excitement as she waved the lottery ticket in the air, her mind already spending what she believed to be her fortune. He could still see Doug's face, flushed and eager, as he told her to book the trip to Naples to start making calls. He wondered if either of them had ever truly seen him as anything other than a vessel for their dreams, a silent partner to their ambitions. He spent the early hours pacing, rehearsing what he would say. He imagined Lisa, incredulous, Doug, belligerent. He imagined the phone calls, the threats, the apologies that would inevitably come when they learned the truth. Part of him wished it could be different, wished there was still time for some kind of reconciliation, some small way back to the daughter he once knew. But every kindness had become a transaction, every act of love measured and weighed until there was nothing left but the final reckoning. He glanced at the briefcase beside his bed, filled with documents, bank records, medical bills, the letter from Margaret, and knew there was no turning back. The day of the lottery drawing arrived, the city locked in a brittle cold. Walter made his way to the house in Syracuse just before dusk, the sky bruised purple and gray. He let himself in quietly, the keys still fitting the lock as if nothing had changed, though he was now a guest in the place he had paid for. Lisa and Doug were waiting, the energy in the room brittle and electric. They had set out snacks, rearranged the furniture so everyone could see the television, tried to make it look like a celebration rather than an ambush. There was an unopened bottle of wine on the table and a stack of bills shoved into a drawer. Walter took a seat in his old recliner, the springs groaning beneath him, and waited. The lottery broadcast flickered to life. Lisa clutched the ticket, her fingers trembling, reading the numbers aloud as each ball tumbled from the spinning globe. Doug stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, eyes fixed on the screen. Walter watched their faces more than the television, saw the hope bloom, saw the calculation and fear chase it in waves. 7, 22, 36, 54, 61. The numbers matched. The room exploded in noise, Lisa shrieking, Doug cursing in disbelief, both of them collapsing in laughter and tears. Walter sat very still, the chaos swirling around him. He could see the future unspooling in their eyes, the house in Florida, the trips, the escape from everything that had ever tethered them to responsibility. They embraced, lost in the fantasy. Only then did Lisa look again at the ticket, frowning. She traced her finger across the paper, her lips moving as she read the name. Her eyes widened. She looked up, her face draining of color, the ticket suddenly heavy in her hand. Doug snatched it, squinting, searching for what she'd seen. Walter could hear his breath catch, the anger rising before the truth had even fully landed. There was a long, dangerous silence, the kind that sits at the edge of a storm. Lisa's voice shook as she asked how it was possible, how the ticket could bear Walter's name. Doug tried to bluster, to insist it was a mistake, to demand Walter fix it. Walter spoke quietly, each word deliberate. He explained about the store, the tickets, the clerk, the legalities. He explained about ownership, about signatures, about how, in New York, the name on the ticket is the only name that matters. He saw the understanding dawn, the hope fade. For the first time in years, he was not the one explaining himself, not the one apologizing for his own existence. He was simply the man holding the truth, and they were the ones left scrambling for excuses. Doug's voice grew louder, the kind of desperate anger that comes from someone who senses power slipping away. He demanded Walter hand over the ticket, called it a family betrayal, threatened to call the police. Lisa wept, begging, saying they could split it, that things didn't have to be this way. She promised to change, to start over, to be a better daughter if only he would forgive her. Walter listened, feeling each word as both an old wound and a strange relief. He realized there was nothing left to fix. This wasn't the kind of pain that could be bandaged, wasn't the kind of family that could be repaired with apologies. He took the ticket from Doug's shaking hand, slipped it back into his wallet. He told them about the new bank account, about the attorney, about the conversations he'd had with people who cared about him. He told them about Margaret's letter, about how she'd urged him to remember his own worth, not to let love become a leash. For a moment, he almost faltered, the weight of it all threatening to send him crashing back into the familiar role of comforter, of peacekeeper. But then he saw the relief on Doug's face when Lisa broke down, the calculation flickering behind his eyes, and Walter knew this was the only way. Doug made one last lunge, hands balled into fists, voice thick with rage. Walter stood his ground, his back straight, his voice calm. He reminded them of the law, of the evidence, of the security cameras at the store. He told them if they called the police, he would welcome it, would relish the chance to lay bare every last detail of the last 3 years. Lisa pulled Doug back, tears streaming down her cheeks. She said she was sorry, that she never meant for any of this, that she was just scared. Walter saw the little girl she used to be, just for a second, and wished he could reach her. But that child was gone, replaced by the adult who had made her choices. He told her he forgave her, but that forgiveness didn't mean surrender, didn't mean giving up his own life one more time. The confrontation ended not with a shout, but with a silence so deep it felt physical. Walter picked up his coat, his briefcase, and walked to the door. He paused, looking back at the living room, the pictures, the threadbare rug, the people he'd loved more than anything. He saw the mess of it all, the way love and obligation had become a weapon, and he felt a kind of peace. He stepped out into the cold, the door clicking shut behind him, and let the winter air fill his lungs. As he walked down the street, the night opened before him, wide and quiet. He didn't know what would come next. He knew only that he was done being the burden, the afterthought, the easy mark. The streets glimmered with frost, and Walter Jennings walked toward the future, each step lighter than the one before. Back at the house, Lisa and Doug sat together, stunned and silent. They had the losing ticket, a future empty of easy answers. They blamed each other, then themselves, then the world. They would tell stories later about how unfair it all was, how Walter had tricked them. But in their quietest moments, they would remember the sound of his voice, steady and sad, as he told them goodbye. At the motel, Walter placed the ticket on the bedside table, turned off his phone, and stared at the ceiling until the sun rose. For the first time in years, he felt something settle in his chest. Not victory, not revenge, but relief. He remembered Margaret's laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the life they'd built from nothing. He let himself grieve, then let himself dream. He knew the hardest days were behind him. He was free. Walter Jennings watched the sun rise through the streaked motel window, orange and gold burning the frost from the world outside. He felt the ache of a sleepless night, his body heavy, but beneath it pulsed something that felt almost like hope, dangerous, unfamiliar, but alive. He sat with his coffee cooling in his hands and let the silence stretch, a silence earned by standing his ground. He was no longer waiting for someone to decide his fate. The future, whatever it would look like, was finally his to claim. He dressed with care, putting on the blue shirt Margaret had always said made his eyes look kind. He ran a comb through his silver hair, tucked the lottery ticket into the inside pocket of his coat, and gathered the paperwork he'd so meticulously collected. For years, his days had been shaped by the needs and moods of others. Today, each movement belonged to him alone. He checked out of the motel just after 8, left a tip for the housekeeper, and caught the city bus headed toward the New York State Lottery office on South Salina. The ride was quiet, the city waking up around him, snow already melting on the sidewalks. Inside the lottery office, everything felt muted, almost surreal. Walter's hands trembled only a little as he slid the ticket across the counter to the woman in the blue blazer. She scanned it, looked at the name, then up at him with new respect. There were forms to sign, instructions to review, the business of money conducted with a kind of bureaucratic detachment. When the final signature was made, Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. They told him the lump sum after taxes, a number so large it hardly seemed real. They asked if he wanted his name public or private. He chose privacy, not out of shame, but because this victory, this reclaiming, was something too personal for headlines. They congratulated him, wished him luck, as if he'd simply stumbled into good fortune instead of earning it every day for the last 70 years. He called Paul Carmichael and Tyler from the bank. Both men celebrated in their quiet ways. Paul with a joke about early retirement, Tyler promising to keep watch over Walter's accounts. Walter arranged for his pension to be rerouted, for a safe deposit box, for the careful, legal transfer of every resource he still owned. He met with a financial advisor, a soft-spoken woman named Maribel, who walked him through the steps of investing, protecting, and spending wisely. With each detail handled, each new piece of his life sorted, the burden in his chest loosened a little more. He didn't return to the old house. There were still things there, clothes, tools, books, fragments of a life that no longer fit, but Walter knew better than to look back now. He wrote Lisa a letter not out of spite, but because some things still needed saying. He told her he forgave her, that he hoped she would find her own way. He told her about Margaret's letter, about the slow, hard lessons of dignity, and that sometimes love meant letting people go, not holding them hostage with guilt. He sent the letter with no return address, knowing she would read it, knowing she would search it for the absolution she'd always craved. He felt no anger anymore, only a deep, complicated sadness. A mourning for the daughter he'd lost, for the version of himself that had believed every sacrifice was a seed of future love. He hoped she'd be all right, but he was finally ready to be all right himself, even if it meant being alone. Walter spent the next weeks in transition. He rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Ithaca, a town with soft hills and quiet lakes and neighbors who didn't know his history. He furnished it simply. A sturdy chair by the window, a bookshelf lined with Margaret's favorites, a table big enough for coffee and the crossword. He cooked his own meals, learned how to make bread, took long walks in the cold, letting the wind strip away the last of his regrets. He joined a book club at the library, found himself laughing more often, sometimes even at himself. He went to church on Sundays not for salvation, but for the music, the ritual, the comfort of sitting among people who asked nothing from him. He bought a used pickup, blue and battered, the kind of car he'd always meant to get. He drove out to Green Lake in the spring, casting a line into the water and thinking of the days he'd spent there with Lisa, with Margaret, with a heart less guarded. He began volunteering at a local food pantry, handing out bags to people who reminded him of neighbors from the old neighborhood, people carrying invisible burdens, people whose stories no one asked about. He found meaning in the small acts, the way kindness could echo quietly, the way it asked nothing in return. At night, when the house was still, he sometimes read Margaret's letter again. Her words had become a touchstone, the anchor that kept him from drifting too far into anger or nostalgia. He realized, slowly, that he was not defined by his losses, nor by the betrayals that had shaped his last years. He was not a victim or a martyr or even simply a lucky man. He was Walter Jennings, survivor of heartache, keeper of promises, builder of new beginnings. News of the lottery win eventually drifted back to Syracuse, though no one knew the winner's name. Lisa tried to call, left messages on his old phone number, wrote emails that went unanswered. She tried to contact him through Tyler at the bank, through Paul at the church, but neither man betrayed Walter's trust. He sometimes wondered what Lisa told people now, if she painted herself as a victim, if she resented him, if she ever truly understood why he'd left. He hoped, for her sake, that she found a way to forgive herself. He knew how heavy that burden could be. Doug drifted out of the story altogether, moving south to chase jobs and schemes that never quite panned out. The house in Syracuse eventually sold, the proceeds just enough to cover their debts. Walter imagined the rooms emptying out, the echo of old laughter bouncing off bare walls, the last traces of his life there fading like footprints in snow. He did not mourn the loss of the house. He mourned only the lessons learned too late, the years spent hoping things would get better, the way family can sometimes hurt you deeper than anyone else ever could. Spring came slowly to Ithaca, green creeping up through the thaw. Walter planted tomatoes and basil in the small garden behind the cottage. He fixed a loose shingle on the roof, mowed his own lawn, found satisfaction in the rhythm of self-sufficiency. He made friends at the market, at the hardware store, at the tiny diner where he ate lunch every Friday. Sometimes, in the easy quiet of these new relationships, he recognized himself again. Not the version shaped by sacrifice and fear, but the man Margaret had loved, the father Lisa once adored, the neighbor who showed up with a shovel when it snowed. He traveled a little, just as Margaret had always dreamed. He stood at Niagara Falls, the spray cold and bright on his face, and felt something close to awe. He walked the streets of Boston, the city bustling with history and possibility, and marveled at how big the world still was. He sent postcards to no one in particular, bought small gifts he didn't need, let himself feel joy without apology. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Walter sat by the lake, letter in hand, and read it aloud to the water. He thanked her for her wisdom, for her patience, for the years they'd shared. He forgave himself for the mistakes, for not seeing what was coming, for trusting too much and too long. He promised to keep living, not just surviving, but truly living, every day that remained. He thought about Lisa and Doug, about the strange balance of justice and pain, about whether what had happened was right or merely inevitable. He knew some would call it revenge, others justice, others simply bad luck. Walter understood that the truth was messier, that sometimes people you love lose their way, that sometimes justice is a quiet choice to walk away, that sometimes freedom means letting go, even of those who once meant everything. In the end, it was not about the money or even the betrayal. It was about reclaiming the dignity to decide his own story, to choose peace over bitterness, to find joy not as a reward, but as an act of courage. That night, Walter stood in the doorway of his small home, looking out at the garden, the stars bright above. He breathed in the cool air, the promise of another season, and felt, at last, a quiet satisfaction. He had survived everything meant to break him, and in the breaking had found himself anew.